All right, welcome everybody to Module 4, where we're going to be exploring adolescent development. And I just want to say at the top that we are going to cover a lot of information in this module. As usual, we're trying to cover physical, cognitive, social, emotional development across all of these different periods of the lifespan. So there will be a lot of content in the Module 4 reading. You'll notice that it's a bit longer than some of the other reading we've had. And as always, right, try to focus on the learning objectives, try to focus on just kind of the main headings and key points under those. Don't try to, take it all in because it will feel like a lot. It probably has felt like a lot of information, but hopefully you're getting some of the main points. So let's go ahead and get started. Just to kind of warm up a little bit here, think about what phases maybe you went through as a young teenager. Maybe some of you are still in high school. You are teenagers now. Others, you might be a little bit older. But as we're talking about teenage development, adolescent development, we're going to be thinking about how the young people start to form a more distinct individual identity. How teenagers begin to develop a sense of self. Did you have a special interest or identify with a certain group in high school for one reason or another? Right? We have different, social groups built around different interests, hobbies, activities. And think about the way that these groups and these interactions help a young person begin to find themselves. And one way to do that is to think about yourself, right? Think about how you started to form an identity through social groups and social connections and peers. Just a little something to think about throughout the presentation today. So we'll begin talking about physical development, and we'll start with puberty, right? Puberty being the sort of entry point into adolescence, which is a time of rapid physical changes, brain changes, body changes that we'll review briefly throughout the presentation. And puberty really begins when this chemical messenger called kisspeptin signals to other parts of the brain that it's time to start releasing certain hormones that are sort of like on a time delay, right? Like these hormones and these are available, and it's not until, and for whatever reason, right, the timing is a little bit different for everybody. But once this chemical messenger signals to the brain, hey, it's time to start producing these hormones, that's kind of when puberty is beginning. And so we start to see things like maturation of what we call primary and secondary sexual characteristics. So genitalia, voice, body hair, pubic hair, things like this start developing and growing. We speak of menarche, which is first menstruation, as the beginning point of entering puberty for females, and spermarchy, when males begin producing sperm, first ejaculation, again, would be kind of an indicator of being in puberty. So we're noticing, again, certain changes, physical changes, body changes that indicate now a sort of moving out of childhood and now getting closer to adulthood. So there's this sort of transition period between youth, right, being a child, and being an adult, which is right where we are here in puberty. And so the timing of puberty is actually important. Early puberty is associated with some negative long-term health outcomes. And we have observed a downward trend in age of onset of puberty across the globe. So not just in Western developed nations, but really across the globe, we've noticed a downward trend in the beginning of puberty. It's just under 13 years old today, is roughly on average when puberty typically begins. But if we go back in time and look at historical data, in like the 19th century, in the 1850s, right, it was closer to 16. And that's a pretty significant age difference. And so there are a lot of theories or explanations for why this might be the case, but it's still not really well known, right? Why puberty is beginning earlier and earlier. It could be environmental influences, right? Diet, what we're eating, physical activity, uh, things like marital discord at home and stress. Um, we know that there is some relationship between chronic stress and early puberty. So perhaps the stress response has some sort of relationship with the release of some of these certain hormones or what's going on neurologically in the brain. But we do know that a protective factor against early puberty or against beginning puberty really early would be a secure attachment, which is interesting to note. Another kind of idea is that we have these EDCs, these endocrine disrupting chemicals that are maybe part of industrial products and things like that. And maybe exposure to certain environmental toxins could be correlated with earlier puberty. But again, these are all possible explanations. It's not really well understood why puberty has begun earlier and earlier. So one of the main physical changes that we note in puberty is what we call the growth spurt, right? There's an average increase in height of 10 inches in just 4 years. So that's a pretty significant, change in terms of height, right? 10 inches. So this is where we start to see kind of what we describe sometimes as like awkward looking teenagers, right? Where their bodies and limbs aren't growing evenly. It's somewhat imbalanced. Different parts of the body are growing at different rates. Internal organs grow at different rates and sizes, depending on biological sex. Increases in the production of androgen and testosterone, which are hormones in the body, lead to more muscle tissue, more muscle mass, an expansion in the size of hearts and lungs, right? So more physical activity becomes possible as children start to age and get older. So these are just some of the changes we note with growth spurt. But just as important to some of the physical changes we observe are the changes that we observe in the brain during adolescence and puberty. Puberty is a time of massive reorganization in the developing brain. Teenagers, young people have what we call highly neuroplastic brain, which means that the brain is just more sensitive to changes. It's much more malleable, moldable, right? You could say. So it's very responsive to changes in the environment, changes within the body. And some of these changes that we observe lend themselves to more open, a sort of more openness, a willingness to take more risks, but at the same time to be more vulnerable to adversity and setbacks. So there's a kind of increase in risk-taking and sensation-seeking. At the same time, there's a greater sensitivity to disappointments and setbacks and adversity. This is also a time of massive neural pruning. This is where we observe reductions in gray matter density. So you'll recall, right, that the brain has this sort of grayish color, which is a result of brain cells, neurons, right, which kind of have this grayish hue. And we're going to observe reductions in gray matter density as the brain starts to prune some of these unused neural connections. So now the brain is starting to become a little bit faster and more efficient as it begins pruning more and more of these neurons away. And at the same time that neural pruning is occurring, right, we're also observing increases in myelination. So you'll recall that myelin is that white fatty substance that coats our brain cells, which leads to more efficient, rapid processing in the brain. So the brain is becoming faster and more efficient, and we might think, okay, that's a good thing. At the same time, though, there's a greater sensitivity to stress and setbacks. So this can lead to, rapid processing that can lead to more impulsivity, though, more disappointment, more frustration, more stress, more kind of mood fluctuations. We also observe in adolescence relative decreases in the neurotransmitter serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter associated with feelings of contentment, well-being. Um, you know, Serotonin is what helps regulate our mood. Okay, and so decreases in serotonin then would be correlated with mood fluctuations, what we kind of refer to as mood swings in adolescence. But we're also, at the same time that we're observing relative decreases in serotonin, we note increases in dopamine, right? A neurotransmitter that's associated with motivation and pursuit of rewarding activities. And so the relative increase in dopamine is going to be correlated with things like risk taking and sensation seeking, because these become in themselves pleasurable and fun. And with more availability of dopamine, this is partly why we're going to observe teens, putting themselves into situations more impulsively that seem fun and exciting, new situations, novel experiences. Again, this kind of expansion of openness. But brain development in adolescence is imbalanced. The brain is not developing evenly from the sort of lower regions upward, right, to the outer layer, the cortical areas. The subcortical regions appear to develop faster than the outer cortical regions of the brain. And you'll recall, right, that the subcortical areas of the brain, sometimes what we refer to as kind of the limbic system, these subcortical areas of the brain, sometimes it's given this sort of colloquial name as like the emotional brain. That the subcortical limbic emotional brain is associated with things like emotional reactivity, attraction to others. And that those regions are developing faster than the prefrontal cortex, the outer layer, the cortical regions of the brain that are associated with more rational, logical thinking, executive functioning. Those areas of the brain develop relatively slower than the subcortical ones. Here's a quote from, the reading, that some researchers argue that sometimes a teen's choices in emotionally and socially charged situations, so think here like, peer situations or, peer pressure or dating, things like that. So sometimes a teen's choices in these emotionally or socially charged situations, especially those involving peers, risk, and or reward, are driven more by these subcortical structures, the emotional brain, the limbic system, what we would maybe call hot processing, because it's quick and rapid, more than the cool regulatory processes of the prefrontal cortex. So again, this is where we're going to see, like, again, higher impulsivity, higher reactivity, teenagers not necessarily weighing carefully the pros and cons, and when it comes to making decisions, that they tend to make these decisions quickly and impulsively. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the subcortical regions of the brain. That's what we're looking at here in this chart here, is sort of these lower regions that are kind of in black here. So this is going to include structures like the amygdala, which we talked about with the stress response, the hippocampus and the hypothalamus, which we also talked about in the context of the stress response, the thalamus, and you don't need to memorize all of these different regions or parts of the brain, but understand that the limbic system, these lower regions of the brain, the subcortical regions of the brain, are what we observe as developing relatively quicker in adolescence. And so sensation seeking becomes a really rewarding thing in and of itself. And what we mean by sensation seeking is the need for different, new, complex sensations and experiences, and a willingness to take on physical and social risk for the sake of these experiences. So this is where you see, viral challenges or viral trends. Like, I don't know, it was 10 years ago, right? You had the Tide Pod challenge, where kids like eating those laundry detergent pods. And you're kind of wondering, like, why the heck would people do stuff like this? Well, this is a kind of why, right? We're looking at decision making and activity and behavior that's not always rational or logical, because it's kind of exciting or fun, and so sensation seeking becomes rewarding, right? And remember, right, we said that there are increases in dopamine during adolescence, and so that kind of drives a lot of this sensation seeking because it feels good, it feels exciting, it feels more ego-syntonic, more kind of congruent with feelings that kind of align with how we think of ourselves, right, as kind of more bold, more risk taking. So again, the emotional brain is maturing more rapidly. So teens might literally anticipate and experience more pleasure from risky behavior than other age groups do, which kind of makes sense. If you're older, so if you're like in your late 20s or 30s, or 40s even, or older, you might understand this a little bit better, right? That, these sort of new, complex, novel sensations aren't always as rewarding as they were when you were, 15, 16, 17, 18. And so, older people don't derive the same level of pleasure and excitement from, this really risky behavior, which again, isn't to say that older people are just boring and dull and stop having, fun and exciting experiences. It's just that they're not as sensitive to the rewards of these experiences as adolescents are. So another important change that we observe in the adolescent period is the maturation of the stress response. So you'll recall what we referred to as the HPA axis when we learned about the human stress response, and that this HPA axis begins to mature in adolescence. So there's more cortisol production happening in the teenage years all the way through adulthood. And at the same time, the HPA axis is growing more sensitive to life stressors. So like a parent's divorce, or getting into a fight with friends, or like peer rejection, that teenagers are far more sensitive to some of these life stressors, partly because the HPA axis is developing more rapidly during this period of time. And as we discussed earlier in earlier modules, right, this idea of chronic stress, ongoing daily chronic stress, is correlated with long-term health deficits. So sleep, right, is an important part of our daily rhythm throughout life, but it's particularly important in the adolescent period because teenagers generally, right, need anywhere between 8 to 10 hours of sleep each night to stay regulated. And we know that given the school schedule, given how late teenagers stay up at night, and how early they have to wake up for school, that they're probably not getting anywhere near as much sleep as they really need, which is why I think recently in California, the start time of school was extended a little bit later in the morning in recognition of some of this research on the importance of sleep. And so it's not just that teenagers stay up late because they just want to talk to their friends all night. Part of the reason teenagers like staying up late is because they exhibit what we call a delayed phase preference, which is wanting to stay up later and wake up later. And part of the reason teenagers have this delayed phase preference is because the timing of daily hormone release is delayed in the adolescent period. So it shifts the sleep-wake cycle to a later sleep time and a later wake time. So the release of, when we talk about the release of some of these hormones around sleep, we're talking about things like melatonin and serotonin. At the time of the day that those hormones are released tends to be later. So teenagers just literally don't feel sleepy sometimes until really late. And so we observe lots of sleep deprivation in adolescence, which sleep deprivation, right, is correlated with certain negative outcomes like less myelination. So less of that white matter that coats our neurons, right? That not getting enough sleep is related to relatively less myelination, less white matter density in the brain. Consequently, that would lead to, well, imagine, right? What would be the consequence of less white matter density? That would be struggling then more with learning, right? Poorer executive functioning. So again, this is really why it's important for teenagers to stay regulated through sleep. So we have this sort of stereotype, right, of moody teenagers, moody kids, right? And some of this is backed up by research, right? They use this research methodology called experience sampling method. And in experience sampling method, what they do is they attach like a sort of little device, a little electronic device. They give that to a teenager. And throughout the day, at random times in the day, this little device will beep, right? It'll make a little beeping noise. And what they do in these studies is they tell, the participants in the study, right? They tell the teenagers, when the device beeps, I want you to fill out this log. And in the log, the teenagers will sort of describe their mood, kind of positive, negative, neutral. And they'll kind of describe, what thoughts they're having, feelings they're having. They're just kind of checking in that moment to see, like, how are they feeling? What is their mood like at that time of the day? And what we observe in these ESM studies is that teenagers report more mood fluctuations, more self-conscious thoughts, more embarrassment, greater emotional reactivity to problems. Teenagers, again, are going to be more responsive to emotional stimuli in general. And at the same time, we notice that it takes longer for teenagers to extinguish learned fear responses. So when we talk about fear responses, learned fear responses, we're talking about, making an association between a particular situation and a feeling that we get from that situation. And we kind of make this association between this context and this situation and a particular feeling. If that particular feeling is fear, right? If we learn to become afraid of a certain stimulus when we're in a particular context, for teenagers, it takes longer for them to disassociate that fear from that stimulus. And so the reading this week will go into more detail on this, but it's just another example of how difficult it is for teenagers to manage their emotions during adolescence. And so another big aspect of the teenage years includes mental health problems, right? That mental health problems become much more common and prevalent in adolescence as compared to early childhood. Around 1 out of 3 teenagers experience depressed mood at some point throughout the day or week. Rates of mental health problems in general increase really dramatically from childhood to adolescence. And based on research that's been conducted, we know that females have nearly 2 times the rate of depression as males. And, that's just a question to ponder, kind of thinking through why might it be that female identifying individuals tend to experience higher rates of depression. We can maybe think beyond just hormones. So one theory might be, well, maybe girls are just more hormonal, more emotional. And, I don't know if that's really the right answer. We might also consider things like cultural views, right, of the body, harassment, bullying, double standards when it comes to sexual activity. So for boys, they, it's popular, it's cool, it's exciting, to be sexually active. But a very sexually active young lady, right, is sort of viewed as a slut, right? Or we have the kind of more negative views of female sexuality in general, right, culturally, than we do for male sexuality. That girls, young ladies, right, do tend to form deeper connections with their peers. And so if teenagers in general are more sensitive to emotional distress, this is where like conflicts with friends can be maybe hit young ladies harder, right, than young men. So there could be a lot of factors here, right? A lot of reasons why this is the case. And it's not to say that young men don't struggle with anxiety and depression, right? Of course, they do, right? I mean, I've worked with many teenagers, young men, right, who struggle with depression and anxiety as well. But what we're just observing here are general trends. And so one of the kind of behaviors that we observe with depression, particularly in young ladies, is this idea of rumination. To ruminate means to kind of like chew on something. And so what we're chewing on with rumination is we're chewing on negative thoughts and feelings, just kind of turning them over and over and over in our head. So rumination is this stable, emotion-focused coping style that involves responding to problems by directing our attention internally toward our internal negative feelings and thoughts, a sort of increase in self-focus, increased emotional reactivity to stress. And this is where young ladies, females, are more likely to ruminate as a defense against things like anxiety. So this is it's a coping style. It's not always a very adaptive coping style, because if you ruminate too much, you can become too focused on negative thoughts and feelings and really find yourself kind of spiraling, chewing over it over and over again. All right, so we call it a defense, but it's not always an adaptive one. And this is where like mental health counseling, learning more effective coping strategies is an important part of supporting young people struggling through depression and anxiety. So we'll talk a little bit here about sexuality and sexual preference as a part of adolescent development. So at around age 10, andronarchy begins. This is kind of bringing the adrenal glands into heightened activity. So remember, we talked about the adrenal glands as being a part of that HPA axis with the stress response. So sexual attraction increases around this time, right? Just before puberty. So think like 4th grade, 5th grade, around that age. This is where attraction begins to heighten a little bit more. Teens begin seeking out more mixed gender groups, kind of breaking that gender segregation that we see in elementary school, right? So if you go around elementary school playgrounds, right, it's not uncommon to see the boys playing with the boys, the girls playing with the girls, right? When we start getting into middle school and high school, we start to observe more mixed gender groups. So masturbation tends to be more common among males, but when educated and it is destigmatized, it is just as frequent among females. And then we have this idea of oral sex, right? So a lot of kids, right, or young teens will kind of see oral sex as not really counting as sex, which raises all kinds of philosophical questions around what is sex and does oral sex count as sex. But it's important to note that for young people, right, there's this kind of idea that it's not the same as penetrative intercourse, so it doesn't really count, but it's still, a type of sexual activity. When we talk about something like sexual debut, we're talking about the age of first coitus, so that would be penetrative intercourse. And we'll look at rates of intercourse rates in a later slide. So when it comes to sexual preference or sexual orientation, the social or cultural explanations for what we would call non-heterosexual behavior don't really stand up to further scrutiny. In other words, there's some people who think that sexual preference is sort of something that kids learn to do by looking at others and observing others, that it's more of a choice maybe. Again, research is kind of mixed on this. It doesn't really support the idea that kids either identify as gay or lesbian because that's what is available to them in their culture, and so they kind of observe that behavior and then kind of decide that that's what their preference is. It doesn't really kind of follow from what we know based on research. There are more promising explanations around sexual preference or sexual orientation in biology. that there perhaps is a biological component maybe to sexual preference. So if we look, for example, at the rate of homosexuality among men who have a gay relative, it's 9%. So we compare that to the rate of homosexuality in the general population of men, which is only 2.4%. So what does that suggest, right? Well, it suggests that there could be some sort of biological basis for sexual preference. In other words, that this may be something that's unrelated to just social or cultural experiences, that it may be related to our sort of biological constitution. On the other hand, we have not identified a specific gay gene that causes homosexuality. So we're not at that point in our understanding here that we can point to a specific gene or even a sort of set of genes. We can't really look at specific polygenetic factors that are correlated with homosexuality. But what is interesting is that they've done studies on fraternal birth order. So referring to the order of births of males in a family. And what they found is that the lower you are in the birth order as a boy in your family, the slightly higher the rate of homosexuality is. And that's not really well understood exactly why that is, but there does seem to be a correlation between birth order in a family and sexual preference. We also could look at things like exposure to varying levels of hormones during prenatal development and maybe postnatal development. Polygenic factors, like that. It could be, again, a constellation of different genes that work together to contribute to sexual orientation or preference. But all of this does point to sexual orientation perhaps being at least partly attributed to biology. And why would that matter, right? Well, it might matter because if it's not just a characteristic that a person chooses, if it's more related to their sort of biological constitution and programming, it's harder for us to justify then discrimination, right, against LGBTQ individuals, right? Because if this is not something that is entirely chosen in all cases, if this is to some degree a result of biology, then it would be kind of cruel to punish people for something that isn't directly within their control, that it's not something that they are choosing to do, that to punish and bully or harass people for their sexual preference or orientation would then be seen as sort of, again, cruel and an unusual sort of punishment. And so that's why maybe it's important for us to think about the role that biology plays in all this as a way of maybe destigmatizing and taking more humane views on sexuality, which, as we know in our culture today especially, there's a lot of intense hostility, right, in particular around transgender identities. So talk a little bit here about sexual fluidity. We observe typically that adolescence and young adulthood is a time of sexual fluidity for some individuals. Teens still spend significant amounts of time with same-sex peers. And this is where, young middle schoolers, young teenagers can begin to experiment sexually with same-sex peers. It's not really terribly uncommon. It doesn't happen in all cases. It's not necessarily something that we observe in all teenagers, but it does seem to appear across different cultures and across different places. When it comes to the complexities of life, it just seems that variation is the norm, right? That what is normative varies, right? It varies tremendously. So I think it's important to lead with curiosity and interest rather than condemnation and bigotry, right? Is one way to counter what we would maybe refer to as internalized homophobia or transphobia, that people have really sensitive feelings about sexuality. It really is a trigger for a lot of people, right? The idea of sex and sexuality and what's normal and what's abnormal. And I think, to defend against a lot of things that can lead to hatred and condemnation of people, that it can be really important to try and just remain curious and interested in the different experiences that different human beings have, as a way of just trying to, create more supportive, humane communities. And so here we have a table that breaks down intercourse rates among teenagers. And this is from a 2016 study. So these numbers may be a bit different in 2025, although it probably wouldn't be massively different. Would be my guess, but I'm sure that the rates are slightly different if we were to take a sample today. But at least according to this study, you can observe some of the trends here, right? That one trend that you can really quickly observe by looking at this table is how the rates of intercourse increase throughout high school, right? Starting at 27.3% for boys, 20.7% for girls in the ninth grade, all the way up to, in the 12th grade, 59% for boys and 57.2% for girls. So we see a general increase in ever having reported sexual intercourse throughout high school. And then we do have a breakdown based on ethnicity and race, just a few categories here. We have white, black, and Hispanic rates here, and we can observe maybe some interesting differences where it looks like for white boys, the rate of sexual intercourse is relatively lower as compared to their black and Hispanic peers, whereas it's a bit flipped for girls, whereas white girls seem to report relatively higher rates of sexual intercourse than their black or Hispanic peers. So not sure, again, what we can make of the data here other than thinking about, well, what is important about sexual intercourse? And, sexual intercourse, is an important part of growth and development, becoming sexually active. And I guess it raises the question of when is a person ready, right, to be sexually active? It's a highly charged emotional sort of encounter. It can be, at least, right? There can be a lot of anxieties and insecurities around sex and sexuality. And so this is where having comprehensive sex education, right, does become really important for young people, right, to kind of talk through what is sex and what are some of the thoughts and feelings that we have around it. Who is responsible for giving this kind of sex education, right? Is it parents? Is it teachers? Is it both? But not talking about sex at all, right? Not having any sort of discussion around sexuality at all, would probably be, in my opinion, right, a problem insofar as it's something that teenagers are going to think about generally, whether we want them to or not. So better to at least discuss and talk about it, right, and explore it at the right time, I would say, right? Doing that at the right time is important, right? When a young person is ready to kind of have that conversation, that it is important to begin exploring some of these ideas and thoughts and stereotypes and social scripts around sexuality, right? That exposure to online pornography is a lot more rampant today for young people than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so children are, getting exposed to sort of sexual images and sexual media a lot earlier. And so without any sort of education around it, without any discussion around it, we could see how that could lead to some, flawed or short-sighted understandings of what sexuality is all about. Okay, so now we're going to be shifting gears quite a bit here and start talking about cognitive development in adolescence. And at this point, we've reached the final stage of Piaget's cognitive stages, which ends with formal operational thought, which begins around 11 to 12 years old, so right on the cusp of puberty. And in this cognitive stage, in formal operational thinking, we observe advancements in the ability to think abstractly. So think like advanced algebra, right? Requires a high level of abstract thought. Solving systems of equations, working with multiple variables to solve an algebraic equation, right? That requires higher and higher levels of abstract thought and thinking. An example of this would be looking at the figure here, figure 9.3 on this slide, the candy problem. From which canister are you more likely to get a yellow candy? Now, if you, being a student at Mission College, will probably look and see this and answer this correctly. But think about how a younger person might answer this question, right? They might think, well, there's 5 yellows in the right canister, and there are only 2 in the left. So if there are 5 in that one and 2 in that one, it's probably the right hand one or the right side one, right? The right canister, because there are more yellow in there. But again, this shows an inability to understand proportions, right? That you're more likely to pull a yellow candy from the left canister because there are two yellows and 1 green. So your chances of pulling out a yellow are actually higher in the left canister. And that would be an example of being able to think a little bit more abstractly. The school curriculum becomes a lot more rigorous and challenging with problems like this for kids. Scientific problem solving is expected more and more, right? Having a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis, taking notes and observations, and then revisiting the hypothesis to see if it stands up to the experiment. That kind of thinking and problem solving becomes expected more as kids age through middle school and high school. And so being able to think at the formal operational level becomes really important for success in school. We'll also talk here about the idea of idealism and the ideal self. And we'll start with this idea that teens often reflect and think about what is possible, right? They start exploring thoughts and ideas a lot more. They start kind of interacting more with the world around them, more with peers. And as our world opens up, right, we get exposed to different perspectives and ways of thinking. And so we begin to kind of question and think about all the different possibilities. Teenagers begin constructing ideals, right, around the ideal school system, the ideal political system, the ideal family system, right? That teenagers are really driven by this sort of ideal, right, of what things should be like. They also often construct an ideal self, right, who they see themselves to be ideally. They, create a sort of persona around certain values and ideals. And these processes, which are normal, can often lead, right, to a more skeptical, rebellious attitude, right? A sort of more anti-authority stance, where we begin to question the received, dogma. We start to question the received wisdom from our elders, and push back against it, right? By seeking out new sources of information, broadening our perspective. But as teenagers grow and start to get new experiences in the real world, right? The real world of work, the real world of other people and other relationships, gradually teaches us that the world is very far from ideal, right? That it's nice to imagine how the world could be or should be, but then we have to deal with the world as it actually is, right? And recognize that it's not ideal, right? That there's a lot of give and take and compromise and having to negotiate, having to consider other points of view and perspectives. And this does, over time in general, begin to soften some of that idealism a little bit. This is maybe where you hear things like, when they're young, teenagers tend to be more rebellious, more anti-authority, less conservative. And then as they get older, maybe that softens out and they become maybe a little bit more conservative as they get older. And there might be some truth in general to that in some cases, but I don't think it's necessarily sort of like an iron law that young people are more democratic and liberal and older people are more conservative and Republican. I think we can observe certainly plenty of variation within age groups when it comes to political preferences, but it is pretty typical, right, for teenagers to adopt a sort of anti-authority position as a way of sort of asserting themselves and asserting their ideals in opposition to the status quo, the way things are. Now, we talked a bit in the last module about the importance of metacognition. And you'll recall, right, that improvements in metacognitive skills facilitate learning and growth. On the other hand, more frequent self-evaluation and self-observation can also contribute to other forms of egocentrism, which we talked about as well in the last module. You'll recall the idea of egocentrism, sort of being very centered and focused on the self. That teens tend to become more inwardly focused, more self-focused in general. And so there may be a darker side to this metacognition when it leads to thinking too much, obsessing too much about the self, right? About you, kind of thinking that you're kind of like, we talk about main character syndrome, right? Somebody who kind of thinks that everything revolves around them. And for teenagers, that is kind of how it feels sometimes. They really do feel that, they're kind of at the center of everything, which is not, atypical or unusual or even necessarily a bad thing. It's just part of social and emotional development. We have these two ideas, which you'll go into in more detail in the reading, on the quote unquote imaginary audience, which describes teenagers' tendency to believe that others must be just as interested in them as they are, right? Surely everyone else is seeing what I'm seeing, or this is kind of like the idea with social anxiety, right? It's like, well, everybody must be thinking about me, right? So maybe we do tend to observe more social anxiety, right, with teenagers as they feel a little bit more insecure, less grounded in the presence of their peers, right? Worried about how they're being judged or evaluated. Because, peer judgment and peer criticism does hit a lot harder for teenagers than it does for older adults. There's also this idea of the quote unquote personal fable, right? A way of artificially inflating one's importance in response to more frequent scrutiny from others. And to read a little bit more about these terms, you can search for these in the reading to go in a little bit deeper. Now, there's this idea of a theory of identity development, which is Marsh's theory of identity development, and that there are two different sorts of processes, two different dimensions, we could say, right? Exploration and commitment. And so on the exploration side, we're talking about, going out of your way to explore and try new things, try new ideas, consider possibilities, trying things out by going out and actually doing them. So that would be referring to exploration, right? That kind of behavior. And then on the other dimension, we have the idea of commitment, meaning a sort of dedication or commitment to a particular identity. So am I committed to this identity of mine is the question, right? Yes or no? Do I feel committed to this, cultural group or ethnicity or, social group? And the question is yes or no, right? So it's yes or no for both. Are you exploring? Yes or no? Are you committed? Yes or no? And depending on the answers, right, we see the different outcomes. So no exploration, but no commitment, we refer to as diffusion. So this is a teenager who's not in the process of actively seeking out any sort of identity and also not committed to any particular identity. It's more diffuse. The word diffuse kind of meaning spread, right? Like it's kind of, all in bits and pieces, not all together. If we say, yes, we are exploring, but no, we have no commitment, this would refer to moratorium, right? So in moratorium, you have a person who's willing to try new things, willing to put themselves out there and engage in different activities and engage with different types of peers and try different kinds of experiences, but not feeling committed to any particular identity or thing. And if we have no exploration, but yes commitment, so in other words, a teenager who's very committed to an identity, but without exploring any of the other possibilities or options, we refer to that as foreclosure. So this might be, if you grow up, for example, like in a religious household, let's say. So say you grow up in a Catholic household, and you don't go outside of that sort of cultural group, that religious group. If you really identify with your Catholicism and you're really committed to that identity, and you don't really explore other options or opportunities, we would say that that would be an example of foreclosure. And then when we have yes exploration and yes commitment, we have what we call identity achievement, which is the idea that you've explored a lot of different options and possibilities, and then you've committed yourself to something that feels egocentric, feels like you, feels like that fits for you. And so, this can kind of make it seem like foreclosure is maybe a bad thing, because achievement sounds good and foreclosure sounds maybe bad. But I don't really look at it as good or bad. I just look at it as just a different outcome. Whether it's good or bad is really context specific and maybe individually specific. So I don't want you to think that achievement means like that's what we should be aiming for, right? We should be exploring a lot and then committing to something. These are just, this chart here is just a way of presenting different outcomes as in the process of forming some sort of personal identity, okay? So we talk about identity development in diverse groups, right? Which of these processes are generalizable across groups and which ones are not, right? So in other words, with exploration and commitment, again, with commitment, if you grow up in a sort of small community where everybody sort of has the same identity, that might actually be perfectly fine, right? Like you feel like you identify with the dominant group or the dominant culture in your community. And so we would look at that as maybe foreclosure, but again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. So exploration really might not be something that a lot of people do in smaller communities. On the other hand, right, if you live in a really small community, but you don't identify with the dominant culture, if you don't find yourself fitting in with the dominant group, and you do want to explore, we could see how that could be a lot more stressful for a person in a community like that. And how does belonging to a marginalized group impact identity development? When certain identities are scrutinized, or there's prejudice against a certain group based on their ethnic identity or racial identity, how is that going to affect identity development? We could imagine some of the ways in which having a marginalized group identity could present problems or challenges, right? Stressors, right? That people in dominant cultures and groups don't experience. So differences in identity development between genders might be most relevant in what we call the interpersonal domain, where women, right, young women tend to value intimacy and social relationships and communal experiences more than men do. Now, again, these are generalities. We're not talking about, again, iron laws or absolute truths, right? We're talking about kind of trends. So we notice that with women, there's a valuing of intimacy with others, closeness with others, and social relationships. And so that would then also have an impact on identity development. Gender identity is especially salient among teenagers, right? Kind of figuring out whether or not their gender identity conforms to their biological sex, right? Whether they feel like it really fits for them. Experiences with discrimination and racism might influence some to reject the dominant culture, right? And achieve an identity based on, again, what we would call opposition to the status quo. And then, there's this idea of having the talk about racism and discrimination, right? So some families, refer to this as the quote unquote talk, right? Where we talk about things like police brutality or police violence or systemic racism and how the world is going to treat you based on your racial or ethnic identity. And I think it's important maybe to consider how that talk is presented. You don't want to have the talk, right, in a way that almost creates paranoia, right, where a young person expects that bad things are going to happen to them. specifically because of their race or ethnic identity, but you still want to be realistic, right, about trends in certain communities and statistics, right, that we observe around incarceration rates or police violence or police brutality. It's important to recognize those realities, but how do we do that in a way that doesn't maybe lead to overblown sort of anxiety or fear that could be limiting in some way, right? We don't want to limit a young person's sense of ambition or aspirations in life by kind of suggesting to them, maybe in a subtle way, that they're going to be held back regardless of how hard they try, right? That's where that talk could maybe go in the wrong direction potentially. So we'll turn our attention now to the biology of sex, which has become a very loaded topic today, as we all know. And what we're going to do here is just look at what is going on in the early development, prenatal development that leads to developing either male structures or female structures. And so we'll begin by kind of following this process of differentiation into male structures. And the key here is this gene that's located only on the Y chromosome. So for people born with XY chromosomes, there's this unique gene located on the Y chromosome called the sex determining region of the Y chromosome, the SRY gene. And the SRY gene codes for a transcription factor that binds to regulatory DNA, which turns on genes that start the production of other proteins that are responsible for the development of gonads into testes. And so there is a point at which the developing fetus has a sort of unisex gonadal structure. It has not yet developed into reproductive parts yet. At this point, when this happens, this is when that differentiation takes place. And so the cells of the male testes begin to produce all these masculinizing hormones, which include what are known as anti-Müllerian hormones and testosterone, which is one of the several male hormones called androgens, which circulate throughout the body and influence the development of many different kinds of tissue in the body. All fetuses develop two sets of ducts called the Müllerian ducts and Wolffian ducts, which can differentiate into reproductive structures. Testosterone and other hormones stimulate the Wolffian ducts, which develop into male structures, such as the seminal vesicles. And anti-Müllerian hormones cause the deterioration of the Müllerian ducts, which could have developed into internal female parts like fallopian tubes, uterus, and the upper part of the vagina. And so, you might have heard this recently, right? That there's a point in development when reproductive structures, part of the reproductive structures in male and female bodies have not yet developed. There's sort of a unisex period of development. But it does tend to go, in general, right, most of the time, in one of two directions, right? Either developing these male reproductive structures or female reproductive structures. And then we'll talk about intersex individuals where there's a sort of ambiguous sort of development that occurs, where it's kind of harder to say exactly, because we know that there are chromosomal abnormalities where we have double XY, XXX chromosomes. And so there are cases where it's not as clear, right? Where there can be a kind of, the influence of hormones in early development can make what we'll talk about later in terms of gender development a lot more ambiguous. And so there's this period that's kind of known as mini puberty, right? Which is kind of in prenatal development. There's a surge of androgen production at 5 weeks of gestation, which goes all the way through the 28th week of gestation. And then there's another subsequent surge at birth through the first couple months. And a similar process unfolds for estrogen production in females. And then after about 5 months into the first year, androgen and estrogen production plateaus, right? It flattens out until puberty begins. And then when puberty begins, there's another surge of hormonal production, which we talked about at the beginning when kisspeptin, right, that chemical messenger signals to the brain it's time to start releasing more hormones. And typically we're talking about things like testosterone and estrogen. So here we'll talk a little bit about gender role development as part of human development. And this is the process of kind of learning to categorize oneself on some sort of gendered basis as either male or female. We'll talk about non-binary gender identities, other kinds of gender identities, transgender gender identities. You know, it starts to become really quite complex. You know, within the first 2 years of life, children do seem to be able to distinguish pictures of men from pictures of women. There's some evidence that they categorize some behavior as sort of male coded or female coded. And a lot of that is going to be based on socialization practices, right? So what does a young child observe in its environment about what does it mean to be male or female? And this is kind of how we start to learn some of that through socialization. Gender stability, right, refers to the understanding that one's gender category usually stays the same over time, right? In other words, there's this idea that boys eventually grow into men, girls eventually grow into women. And this seems to occur to most children between around 3 to 4 years of age. There's this kind of recognition that that young boys grow up to be men, that young girls grow up to be women. And we say that usually the case because, as we know, right, it's not always the case. The idea of gender constancy is this recognition that gender category membership tends to stabilize then and becomes kind of permanent, in the sense that once a gender identity is established, it persists. So in other words, if I identify as male, if that's a gender identity that conforms to how I feel subjectively, that I kind of see myself as male, that gender identity persists. I continue to see myself as male, for example. But with gender identity, right, there are a lot of social processes going on in terms of how one acquires a gender identity. Genital characteristics and genetic endowment lead adults to categorize most newborns as male or female. And so that is done primarily by checking the genitals, right? Is it a boy? Is it a girl? And that's kind of where this process really begins. And as we'll see with intersex children, right, they often develop what we call ambiguous genitalia. It might not really be clear whether we're looking at what we refer to as male or female. And sometimes there are sort of like genital reconstruction surgeries that are done at that time, right, at pregnancy and birth, where a sort of gender identity is almost sort of selected by the adults, right, where they kind of will do a surgery to either make the genitalia look more female in form or more male, in form. And so with intersex children, that leads to a lot of difficulties in puberty. Puberty is a tremendously challenging time for a lot of intersex individuals for that reason. And the way others speak about us and to us can reinforce a sort of gender assignment, right? For example, hearing adults say things like, "Wow, you're such a big girl helping out like that around the house," right? Or "You're our sweet little boy," right? And so the way that adults speak to children can kind of reinforce this idea of belonging to a gender category. And as children acquire language around 2 and begin experiencing more self-conscious emotions, they also begin learning more about their gender category. And this is where, we can kind of reinforce these kind of male-coded or female-coded behaviors. This is when you start hearing things like, the boys don't cry sort of line, right? Is when you start kind of learning what does that mean exactly. And a lot of that is sort of imposed on us as children, right, from parents and adults who kind of reinforce this idea of belonging to some sort of gendered category. there are like a number of intersex conditions which you can read more about in the reading this week. So if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to go into the reading and dive deeper. But there's an intersex condition known as congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH, in which biological females, so individuals with XX chromosomes, are exposed to high levels of androgens. And as we noted previously, right, androgens are these masculinizing hormones. So there are biological females that are exposed to high levels of androgens during prenatal and postnatal development. These females usually have the internal organs of a female, so they'll have like a female reproductive system, but they'll have more masculinized genitalia, as in like a relatively enlarged clitoris. And this is typically when they use surgery to alter genitalia at birth or shortly thereafter, and that kind of remains a really controversial practice. So if a female like this with CAH develops an enlarged clitoris, this is where they might use surgery to kind of shorten the clitoris or try to make it look more typical of female genitalia. And that's kind of a decision that's made usually right around that time. Before maybe, the individual has kind of any say, there's kind of a decision made on behalf of the child of kind of how do we want this genitalia to look, and do we want it to conform more to female sort of gender understandings, male, right, and so on. So it's, again, a controversial practice. There's a lot of intense sort of debate on this practice. And I invite you to go in deeper in the reading to study that some more. Let's talk a little bit about the role of cognition in gender identity. So having this idea of a self-concept, right, how I think about myself, implies, right, that the way we think about ourselves and how we think about ourselves, right, shapes our identity, what kinds of thoughts we have about ourselves as we're growing. And children learn about themselves, right, through their experiences, of course, but also through language acquisition and more advanced cognitive skills. And once children are able to think beyond concrete labels, they might fight that their assigned gender category isn't congruent with their subjective experience, right, of being a person. They may not feel that their assigned gender category corresponds to their own gender identity and development. So how is gender decided? It's like as if it's a decision that's just sort of made at some point, right? But as we noted right earlier, genital characteristics frequently serve as the basis for gender categorization, right? But the question is, do young children know that this is the case? They don't necessarily understand that, right? For most kids, it seems that, gender categorization is based on like more superficial appearances, how people look externally, right? After all, no one checks each other's genitals before referring to one another as sir or ma'am. Now, of course, again, kind of as we're observing in the culture today, this is becoming, an area of intense sort of debate around, especially around bathrooms and using women's spaces, and transgender females using women's spaces. And, and again, it kind of raises questions. Well, how would you even know, right? Would you ask people to start exposing themselves, right, to kind of prove their gender identity? Again, you can understand why this leads to a lot of intense feelings on both sides. When children do understand the role that genitalia plays in assigning gender, then they're less likely to be confused about gender constancy, that idea of gender being relatively stable and permanent once you've sort of landed on a gender identity. And so we'll return to biology because, as we've seen in this course all the way throughout, that biology does play an important role in human development over time. When it comes to intersex children, for example, right? Let's say there's an intersex child born with XY chromosomes, but is raised female, right? This definitely, we saw an example of this in the last Olympics, right? There's the boxer, right? Who it was discovered, or they did, genetic testing and found that this boxer has XY chromosomes, but was competing in the female category. And, that led to all kinds of, debate, right, around, whether or not that's fair in women's sports, right? And I think that's certainly a worthy debate, right? Important questions to kind of think about. But if we imagine an intersex baby that's born with XY chromosomes, but is sort of raised female, by the time they reach puberty, right, how are they going to navigate that gender identity? Some might accept it, others might reject it. Again, it's very complex. And so we turn our attention now to the idea of gender nonconformity and transgender identities. Even the title here on the screen could be really triggering for some people. The idea of transgender children, right, has become debatable for some people, right? That children, I guess the argument goes that, children are too young, too naive, too underdeveloped in a lot of ways. And so if they think that their gender identity does not correspond to their biological sex, that's just because they're kids, and we should allow them to grow up into their adult bodies, and they'll work through this confusion as they get older. On the other hand, there are people who will say that children are not confused about their gender identity. And if their gender identity does not conform to their biological sex or does not align with their assigned biological sex, and they persist in believing that we should believe them, that, that they're being truthful, they're being honest, that they really are struggling. And so this is where we get the phrase gender dysphoria, right, which refers to intense distress about one's assigned gender. In those cases, right, of gender dysphoria, biological sex does not correspond to one's gender identity. And then we also see things like gender nonconformity in children, right, which refers to the refusal to adhere or conform to gender-based societal expectations for feelings, behavior, and appearance. So the way that they dress, the way that they talk, the way that they act. They sort of reject or refuse to act or behave or dress in ways that conform to a particular gender identity. And a lot of young kids will display some outward signs of gender nonconformity. It's not really that unusual, but fewer kids persist in doing so through puberty and adolescence. And again, there is some research here by Olson from 2015, which suggests that children really are not as confused as adults seem to think when it comes to their gender identity, at least. Of course, we're going to hear lots of stories of people who maybe detransitioned later in life and who regretted, in some cases, making that decision to pursue a transgender identity. We should take those stories seriously too. But you also hear some people who detransition later in life who still will believe that transitioning at that time made sense to them, even if later they end up detransitioning. So it's a complex topic, right? There are a lot of different perspectives and stories of individual cases that we should keep in mind. And like I said, I think leading with some curiosity and interest when it comes to some of these topics is the best way to go, right? To kind of reserve judgment on entire categories of people until we've really kind of wrestled with a lot of the information available to us. So now let's talk a little bit about gender and behavior. Many people believe that our behavioral tendencies are strongly influenced by our gender identity. There's some research that suggests that there are some domains in which men and women do clearly differ in some ways when it comes to levels of aggression, for example, where men may statistically trend more toward more aggressive behavior than women. Language skills, verbal IQ, math skills, spatial skills, that maybe we tend to observe differences in performance across different skill areas based on gender. And then that then sort of corresponds to how we then see ourselves, what strengths we have, what we think we're good at. And a lot of that can be based on gender identity. But it is very difficult to reduce these differences entirely right? 100% to gender and not other cultural, social, historical factors as well. Are women really more sociable and pro-social than men? Are men really more competent at complex problem-solving tasks that require kind of spatial analysis? Maybe there are these differences, right? And yet maybe it's not entirely based on gender alone, right? That socialization practices and the way that we raise children has a big role to play in all of that as well. And so we noted this idea that in elementary school, there's this kind of gender segregation that goes on, right? Where although boys and girls do not seem to differ much in research lab settings, they do spend a lot of their free time quite differently. That around 2.5 to 3 years old, children begin to segregate based on gender, with boys preferring to spend time with boys and girls with girls. Of course, this is not always the case. We're not saying that all boys pursue boys and all girls pursue girls at this age. We're just saying that generally speaking, that's what we observe. But when children are about 4, they spend up to triple the amount of time with peers of the same biological sex as they do with other sex peers. And by the time they are 6, they spend 11 times more time with same-sex peers. And as we noted with adolescence, that begins to change, where in adolescence, we start to observe more mixed gender groups. And so what are the effects of this kind of gender segregation that we observe? And how much of this gender segregation, again, is it the result of intrinsic drives toward spending time with same-sex peers? And how much of that is sort of facilitated or influenced by socialization practices? Again, it's a really open, important question. But boys tend to increase their activity level when they're around other boys. Boys tend to roughhouse more in the company of other boys. Boys often use this kind of rough and tumble play as a way to sort themselves or compete, right? That boys tend to be really competitive with one another in elementary school, right, around who's the fastest, who's the strongest, who's the best at basketball, who's the best at football, and so on and so on. Whereas relationships among girls seem to be more cooperative, and they tend to choose friends based more on personality, right, rather than these external traits. Like girls tend to reenact more family-based play and seem more interested in relationships in general, showing greater interest in boys' play than boys show in girls' play. Now again, these are trends, these are patterns. And why would young girls typically play things like house or family-based games? Again, does that have a lot to do with socialization? Does that have a lot to do with just the sort of intrinsic differences between males and females? These are questions that researchers continue to pursue. We'll talk a little bit about the ways that we observe young boys and young girls speaking, right? Collaborative versus domineering discourse. In collaborative or affiliative speech, which is more often used among girls, children's responses are keyed to what someone else has said. So they're taking in a little bit more of what other people are saying, what they hear their peers saying, right? So if girls are playing a game where they're playing kind of like a family-based game, and both girls want to play, the mommy role, right? Well, you want to be the mommy. I want to be the mommy. Well, why don't we both be the mommy sometimes? We'll take turns. You could see this is kind of a more kind of collaborative way of relating to each other. Whereas in more domineering or power assertive speech, which is more typical among boys, we hear more commands and restrictions, right? Don't move that block, build the road there, that goes there, put that here, right? And again, how much of this speech is influenced by the way that young kids hear, adults speaking about stuff, right? How much of it is social learning? You might ask yourself, right? And I think that's a good question to ask, right? How much of it is sort of biologically based? How much of it is learned socially? And again, throughout this course, I'm going to really kind of die on this hill that it's not biology or society. It's always going to be a blend of both, okay? We cannot overlook one at the expense of the other, because we're going to be missing something if we focus only on the biology or if we focus only on socialization. We're going to be missing something important. So the upshot, the conclusion here, right? Gender segregation in childhood, perhaps the most pervasive gender difference, may be both an outcome of some gender differences and a source of others. I think that's an important point to hold on to. Individual differences, social processes, biology, all of these factors contribute to a felt sense of gender identity. So again, I'm going to reinforce that point, right? That if you want to say that it's all socialization and it's all social learning, well, you're going to be missing a lot of important information that goes into it. Well, the individual and individual biological differences still matter. On the other hand, if you're going to say this is all biology, this is all based on our genes, this is all based on nature, you're going to be missing social learning. You're going to be missing how some of that might be reinforced socially. So I'm really going to challenge you to try to hold both of those together and not sort of lose one at the expense of the other. So we're going to be kind of turning our attention now more toward social development in the teenage years. And we're going to start with this idea of social competence. That as kids enter school, friend groups form and social skills are required to gain general peer acceptance, right? Social skills matter. Social skills are important. So what is social competence, right? We're talking about social skills here, right? Appropriate levels of eye contact, give and take discourse, right? You say this, I respond, and I say this, and you respond, we give and we take. Use of language. So all of these social skills, right, play a role in the formation of social groups, right, and friend groups. Children interpret negative acts as intentionally malicious when committed by disliked peers, but not when committed by more popular peers. That's kind of interesting. I think that may be something to kind of think about. Why would a kid interpret some sort of negative behavior like being insulted or teased or something as more intentionally malicious when it's committed by someone they dislike? When it's done by somebody who's more popular, we tend to overlook the negative, malicious intent behind that. I'll let you kind of think a little bit more about that. Networks. Compared with preschool and its relatively simple context of peer relationships, elementary age kids and teens begin forming more complex webs of relationships. We have friend groups and cliques begin to form in upper elementary and middle school, and usually over some sort of shared interest, anime, sports, media, games, gaming, right? People tend to maybe cluster around certain shared interests. And that's where we have these more complex webs where you may have friends with a lot of different interests and form these more complex webs of relationships. Friend groups provide a context to practice important social skills, right? Conflict resolution, perspective taking, joint goal setting, effective communication, right? That this is really important for us to learn, right? This is very important for kids to learn how to get along with peers, right? As we grow up and form communities and neighborhoods and work together as a community, that we have to learn how to do that. And you can see that, most adults kind of struggle doing that kind of stuff, right? Resolving conflicts, taking each other's perspective, setting goals together. That in a lot of ways, we see a lot of older people struggling with these things as well, right? So it's not just kids who struggle with, some of these social skills. So there's this field of study, it's called sociometry. And sociometry is a way of assessing social competence and evaluating peer status within social hierarchies. Group processes are mediated by forces of attraction, repulsion, and indifference. Interpersonal relationships within groups can be understood as the outcome of these dynamic forces. So who we're attracted to, and I don't mean just attracted, physically or sexually, just people that we're drawn to, that we're interested in, that we like and that we dislike, and that formations of groups are really sort of mediated by these forces of who we're drawn to, who we're repulsed by, who we dislike. And so we tend to then cluster around people with some sort of shared interest, maybe as a way of forming a social network. Children's social preferences can be measured by simply asking them to rate their peers based on favorability scales. So what that means is, right, giving kids a sort of questionnaire or survey in which they, sort of evaluate their peers based on these different rating scales, right, around, attractiveness, desirability, likability, right, and so on. And they kind of will rank or evaluate their peers based on these questionnaires. And this is a way of sort of measuring a kid's social preferences. And a child's cumulative social impact can be measured by counting up all the positive and negative nominations of their peers. So this is a way of studying, when we talk about cumulative social impact, we're talking about how much does this individual child, how present are they in the minds of the other children? How much do the other kids think of this child, and what exactly do they think of this child? Do they see them as likable or more disagreeable? And so this is a way of kind of like assessing the sort of social impact of individuals. And that leads to the development of what we call sociometric categories, right? Children can be categorized into sociometric groups based on their social impact. And there's these 5 main subgroups that are based on research by Coy. Popular, these are the kids that are well liked. These are the kids that get more favorable comments. Average, this is where there's maybe kind of a 50-50, right? Some favorable comments, maybe some disfavorable comments. We have neglected. This is kids who just like don't even show up in other kids' reports, right? They're just kind of like forgotten or neglected, not included. You have rejected, which would be kids who have more disfavorable, right, or unfavorable, I guess you could say, more unfavorable ratings than favorable ones. And controversial would be where controversial kids would be ones who have like really high favorability with some kids, but then really, really low favorability with others, or really high favorability in some areas and really low favorability in others. So that's what it means by controversial. It's kind of like polarizing, right? They're kind of polarizing. You either really like them or really dislike them. It's kind of like you either love them or hate them, kind of a thing. That's what makes them controversial. So in this context of sociometric categories, popular doesn't necessarily mean someone with lots of social clout or power. Rather, popular designates a peer who is well liked by others, right? Regardless of their clout or whatever. Just, think about this as just kids that other kids seem to like. Like, he's just a nice guy. He's just, that's just like a nice kid. They're kind, they're polite. They don't necessarily need to be the most influential kids. They're just well liked by their peers. And again, we said average children receive kind of an average number of nominations, whereas in the neglected category, we say they receive few or none. And again, we kind of already described kind of what rejected and controversial means, but you can kind of look over that here. So this is just a chart that kind of charts the social preference based on those different categories, where really, really high scores of people who are liked the most and who kind of have you see there's 2 different dimensions here. There's social preference, which is kind of going on the y-axis here, up and down. And then kind of, x-axis here, side to side, the horizontal line is social impact. And you can see where these different categories fall based on high social preference and well-liked being popular, average kind of being right there in the middle in terms of likability, preference, and social impact. Rejected, where we see really low social preference, kind of least liked by their peers. And where neglected and controversial fall on opposite sides of social impact, where controversial, kids tend to have a relatively higher social impact and kind of medium in terms of likability, whereas neglected kids tend to have very minimal social impact, but again, kind of medium sort of favorability. And I guess I'll just say this, right, with these categories. I mean, it's not really we're going to have maybe some different feelings about lumping people into categories, right? Obviously, right? There are kids who, these categories may be different from one school year to the next, right? There could be a lot of changes in terms of perception of others over time. So yeah, we definitely shouldn't invest too much stock into where a kid might fall at any given time into these categories. Rather, it's just a way of understanding the kind of general vibe around that peer at the time of this assessment. It's just kind of a way of understanding that, of maybe assessing in the moment how they're being perceived by others. And so if we look at the characteristics of some of these different kids, right, what we maybe note with popular kids is that they have good perspective taking skills. They're assertive, but not deliberately antagonistic or disruptive to others, right? So they're able to assert their needs, but not in a way that's antagonistic or conflictual. High levels of self-regulation, right? So relatively higher in executive functioning. Above average ability for problem solving, right? So that's kind of the characteristics we associate with the popular category. With the rejected category, again, this is the most heterogeneous category, meaning there's the most variance in terms of perception. Above average levels of aggression are most commonly associated with rejected status. So really, really aggressive kids are generally not well liked, right? It's really not hard to understand why, right? The kids who are really, overly aggressive, pushing other kids around, really conflictual, really, sort of hostile at times, that they're not going to really be well liked by their peers for that reason. But rejection can also follow from social withdrawal. So self-isolating is sort of frowned upon, right? Kids who are more withdrawn or keep to themselves can be rejected for that reason too. It's not that they're just all aggressive. They can also be a little bit more withdrawn, right? Maybe socially anxious. Higher levels of instrumental aggression, emotion dysregulation, and negative affect. And so there is a clear pathway here, right? From peer rejection to bullying behavior later on, right? That we can see that, rejected kids then would be most likely perhaps to exhibit more bullying behaviors as they get older. And we'll talk a little bit more about characteristics of some of the categories. With neglected, we have lower levels of peer interaction, generally less aggressive than rejected and average peers. Whereas the rejected, withdrawn children feel anxious about social interactions, neglected children show less anxiety about social situations. It appears that they just simply opt out in some cases. They just don't have a really high social interest. They're just as likely to have a best friend or a couple close friends as an average or popular peer. So with neglected, we're not suggesting that they have no friends, that they're just completely forgotten. They may have one or two really, really good friends, but it's just that the rest of the kids might not really know them because they tend to be just really more low-key, really more quiet in social settings. We'll talk about gender and cultural differences. Greater intolerance for gender non-conforming behavior for males than for females. In other words, when males exhibit gender non-conforming behavior, when males do more female-coded behavior, that tends to be more triggering and upsetting than vice versa. Right? When we talk about the stereotypical tomboy girl, right? A girl who kind of acts boyish, that's usually not as triggering or upsetting to people as boys who tend to exhibit more feminine coded behavior. Boys are more likely to be rejected for behaving in feminine ways, whereas girls who behave in masculine ways are more likely to be accepted by their peers, right? And I'm curious if that kind of resonates with you or how you see that, but that's generally what we observe. Cultural values impact popularity. What does a society value, right? What if shyness or caution is a valuable cultural asset, right? In more reserved sorts of cultures, being too outgoing or too loud might actually be considered a negative trait. Pro-social behaviors typically associated with popularity, antisocial behaviors, typically associated with rejection. And this idea of how are kids taught to settle their conflicts? How does the culture support conflict resolution? And this is kind of like developing emotional literacy, right? Being able to share and express feelings, perspective taking, being able to collaborate on a solution together, right? How is that being taught and facilitated at home and at school is an important assessment question. So just quick kind of reviewing some of the major changes we've covered here, right? Dramatic, startling, and rapid physical changes in the body during puberty. We have the emergence of adult sexual needs, sexual interest. Hormonal shifts and changes result in frequent mood instability. The capacity to reflect on the past and wonder about the future expands, which really heightens this egocentrism, right? So this is where we start to now think more and more about things from the past, but also where we're going in the future. And it all tends to be very self-focused in a lot of ways. A drive toward autonomy and individuation contends with the desire for safety and belonging. All right, and I think that's a really important one to pause on here. A lot of you are probably at an age, right, where you're maybe feeling this a little bit, right? There's a drive toward individuating, becoming independent, setting out on your own. And at the same time, there's this desire for safety and connection, to support, to belonging, right? Kind of becoming yourself and becoming independent can be a little bit scary. Where am I going to belong, though? Where am I going to fit in when I become independent? Who will my friends be? Where will I belong? Right? So those two forces are frequently in conflict during puberty and early adulthood. And for a lot of people, maybe even well into adulthood. So the move from teenager to adult is not unlike the move from infant to young child, right? It's a kind of second individuation. Just like we observed with children, right? There's a growing need for autonomy to explore and to figure out who they are in the world. There's an increased need for independence and autonomy in adolescence, right? And it's important for adults to recognize that teenagers have a need for increased independence and autonomy. And when adults can support that, right, in the context of a trusting and caring relationship, we can really help kids grow in feeling comfortable and confident to become independent and to strike out on their own. I'll talk a little about peer influence here and how the ability to resist peer influence decreases sharply between 5th and 8th grades. Boys are generally more susceptible to peer influence than girls. Peer influence becomes noteworthy in the context of risky behavior. So it's interesting, right, that in development, when we are getting close to puberty, we tend to gravitate more toward our peers and start to move a little bit more away from parents. And so peer influence does become a really significant part of development here. This is where we get into ideas of like peer pressure and who's vulnerable to peer pressure. What kind of kid is going to find themselves really vulnerable to peer influence in a more negative way? Might be a good question to wonder for assessment. And so when we talk about the importance of peers, we should note that social psychologists have long asserted that under conditions of stress, people will group with those who are perceived to have similar experiences. That's the whole idea of birds of a feather flock together. And so if we think about the adolescent period as a period of real stress, it makes sense then why kids will be drawn to kids who have similar life experiences or similar interests or preferences as a way of finding some strength during a really stressful period of life. And teens are frequently in close proximity to their peers, spending a lot of time in school, clubs, activities, sports, increasing access and availability. Teens often imitate their peers as they work on establishing an identity, right? So trying to figure out who I am, I might mimic or imitate friends as a way of kind of trying out a behavior or trying out or kind of going through a phase of some kind, like joining some kind of clique or group or club and kind of imitating and mocking the mannerisms and behavior of those people as a way of, like we talked about with Marcia's theory of identity development, right? Kind of exploration, right? Trying things on, trying things out to see if they fit for me or not. And there's a lot of different ways that peer networks are structured, right? A few close friends, then we have maybe a larger friend group made up of several smaller close groups of friends, and what we call the general crowd, right? Crowd members generally share similar interests, attitudes, behavior, and appearance, right? This is where it's a kind of a generic word, right? I'm in that crowd, you're in that crowd, I don't know, how useful, again, some of these categories are sometimes for understanding peer networks, but they may still have some validity. Crowds generally promote certain values and can sometimes serve as the core of an individual's identity. And then we have what we call conventional versus non-conventional crowds, where non-conventional crowd membership is associated with higher rates of delinquency. So when we say conventional versus non-conventional, we're talking about conforming to sort of general standards and social norms would be kind of more conventional. Non-conventional would be kind of bucking the status quo, going against some social norms. I guess you could, see that that's correlated maybe with slightly more antisocial tendencies or behaviors. Then there are cultural considerations that we have to take into account, right? Even within highly conformist cultures, like in Singapore, adolescents still, right, break out into fairly diverse crowds. Cultural values and priorities shape how teens express emerging identity. In Singapore, for example, there is no comparable quote-unquote popular crowd to the stereotypical popular crowd as we see in various media representations in America, because the stereotype with like the popular kids in high school is, I don't know, maybe this is different today, I don't know, but when I was growing up, at least, we think about the popular kids would be kids who had like large social gatherings or kind of parties, bigger parties where everybody kind of crowds together. Well, if a culture doesn't really have this sort of value, right, or if partying isn't really a thing, then what looks to be popular is going to look a lot different based on what is valuable or what is important within that culture. So this is, like we say, a fuzzy concept. Categorizing people into crowds is challenging. What do you do with people who belong to several crowds? Does the teen pick the crowd, or does the social hierarchy sort people into designated crowds? We have kind of three factors maybe to consider. Personalities, right? Individual personalities and interests as they enter adolescence. The types of crowds that are available, obviously, is going to be a factor. And the ways that parents attempt to manage their children's peer relationships, right? How involved are parents in keeping track of what their kids are up to? And so as we noted, right, the role of parents is shifting in adolescence. Teens begin to separate more from their parents and maybe begin to de-idealize them a little bit more as they get older, push back a little bit more against their values, adopt a more skeptical stance toward authority, as we mentioned earlier. And parent-child relationships, right, vary and differ across cultures. There's that idea of filial piety, right, a traditional value in some Eastern cultures, right, provides an alternative perspective on parent-child relationships in adolescence. And over here on this chart, you can see adolescents' likelihood of endorsing parental legitimacy and their own obligation to obey by age. So we see at younger ages, children will endorse their parents as a legitimate authority and say that they have an obligation to obey their parents. As we start to move to the right on this graph, what do we notice? Right? That there's a decreasing sense of parental legitimacy and a decreased sense of obligation to obey what their parents say. Parent-teen conflict is a really important area for assessment when you're working with teenagers, right? The way parents respond to teens' pushback is important, right? How do parents maintain that soft touch, firm edge, boundary setting and limit setting we talked about in an earlier module? Some conflict in this period of development just seems like it's going to be inevitable, right? Kids are going to start to buck, right? Their parents start to push back, start to rebel a little bit more. And much of this conflict seems to center on who can or should control behavior, right? So parents who think that their kids should behave themselves and control themselves, and that the kids are responsible for all that. That parents are just there to kind of put food on the table and put a roof over your head, and it's your job to obey the rules and figure this out. That's going to obviously lead to a lot of disconnection, right, between parents and children. That parents should be playing a role in helping kids manage emotions, cope with difficult emotions. That parents still have a role through the teenage years, right? On moral questions, teens frequently accept the legitimacy of a higher authority. But in personal and social domains, what is deemed appropriate might be more contested. Parents can get frustrated with their teens' choices in part because they make life appear to be more needlessly complicated or taxing. Right? Parents who view their kids as just being too difficult. That it's just kind of adds a strain to them, and as a result, they kind of back away or back out, and how, that leads to, again, a sense of disconnection. Changing communication patterns. Teens want to exert more control over their appearance and body. So when parents push back or try to exert control, right, power struggles are going to follow. So in protracted, highly conflictual cases, teens will generally begin sharing less with parents and keep more secrets. There are lots of reasons why a teen might keep a secret, right? They don't want to disappoint their parents. They don't want to get punished. They don't feel their parents have a right to know about it. Youth who live in more individualistic cultures generally feel that much of their behavior falls in the personal domain. So this is just relating to me, and so it doesn't need to be shared with anyone else. Parental monitoring here. How much should parents supervise or monitor their teens' activity? We do notice trends in that more monitoring is associated with lower levels of delinquency and aggression. But how should parents monitor their children? Right? Parents do often solicit their teens about what they're up to. Hey, tell me about what you did last night at so-and-so's house. How they solicit this information could make it either more or less likely that a teen will engage with them. So there's a difference between, hey, it seems like you had a good time last night at so-and-so's house. What was that like? What did you guys get up to? Versus, hey, I noticed that you were out really late last night. What were you guys doing out there? Right? So it's like the way a parent communicates their interest in trying to solicit information is going to have an effect on what that teen is going to want to share. Some studies suggest that parental knowledge, just knowing what's going on in a teen's life, is more important than the monitoring or soliciting information. So just that parents have general knowledge about their child's schedule, what they're up to, that's just as important, maybe even more important than specific monitoring or soliciting. We'll talk about parental control. Parental harshness and psychological control, obviously, for reasons that are not hard to understand, I think, is correlated with more negative outcomes. In some cases, living in a neighborhood with high crime or violence, parents feel that they must be more directly controlling to keep their children safe. But look, it doesn't have to be either or, right? You can say, well, I really need to be more assertive and controlling of what my child gets up to because it's dangerous out there. But you can still do that in a way that's compassionate and kind and warm, right? Without being, psychologically controlling. Teens are more likely to develop internalizing problems under conditions of psychological control. So remember, with psychological control, this is going back to an earlier module, we're talking about manipulation tactics, inducing guilt or shame as a way of controlling how a person acts or behaves, kind of guilt tripping people. That tactic doesn't really tend to lead to kind of good mental health for a teenager. So balancing protection of one's child with supporting their growing developmental needs is the task of parents across child development, right? Again, that's probably one of the most important ideas from this course. So let me say it one more time. Right? Balancing protection of one's child with supporting their growing developmental needs is the task of parents across child development. We're always asking, what is it that developmentally speaking this child needs? How can I support that while also being protective and while also setting appropriate limits? How do I make that strike the right balance there? So how well do schools support teens' developmental needs? Right? When students think about their favorite teachers from school, they often invoke qualities that are strikingly similar to what we described as authoritative parenting in an earlier module. High warmth, high demandingness. Right? This is pretty common. When you think back to some of your favorite teachers, they were usually the teachers that pushed you really hard, that had really high expectations of you, but were also really kind and warm and generous and loving, right, in a way. That's kind of like the best mix, right? When a teacher sets a really high bar, but communicates in a way that's really encouraging and supportive, right? Involving teens in the construction of classroom agreements and norms promotes their enhanced executive functioning and supports their growing need for autonomy. So this is where teachers can involve teenagers in the development of what are the norms that we all want to live by in this classroom. Let's involve you in that process. So it's not like a top-down sort of decision. It's like slightly more of a democratic sort of decision that we all make together. But high expectations alone are insufficient for student achievement. Just having really high expectations isn't enough, right? You also need to provide the scaffolding, the support, the care along the way. A part of the growing responsibility of adolescence often includes work opportunities and leisure activities, right? Sports, clubs, after-school programs. There is a fairly strong correlation between involvement in activities and academic achievement. More involvement, higher achievement. So the more involved kids are at school through clubs and sports and activities, typically the better they will do. And this, I used to coach high school sports, and you had to maintain at least a C average, right, to stay on the team, I think, right? So that's an example of how participation in sports can kind of motivate kids to keep their grades up. Involvement in activities also promotes interpersonal occupational skills, right? Communication, collaboration, problem solving, scheduling, accountability, right? Making sure that you're showing up to help the team, support the club, right? That kind of involvement really helps you out and sets you up for success in adulthood. And we can talk a little bit about teens in the workplace, right? There are a number of benefits to working for pay as a teen, right? Learning how to budget, finance, boosting self-esteem. However, there are also drawbacks, right? Potentially. Having less time for friends and family, just feeling burnt out and overworked, having less time for homework and study. And so this raises the question, right? Do teens who work need to work? What are the factors that might influence teen employment? Historical trends point toward increasing rates of teen employment over time. So this could be that some teenagers have to work because they have to support their families, right? Like, I got to help my family make rent or put food on the table this month. So sometimes it's a necessity, right? Kids actually do need to work to kind of help the family out. And then that kind of raises the question, like, just what kind of jobs are available for teenagers? Are they worthwhile jobs? Are they good jobs? What are the effects of increasing media consumption on teenagers? Right? TVs, gaming, consoles, tablets, smartphones, laptops, so on and so on, right, are among the devices that teens report feeling, quote, constantly connected to in daily living. Really high rates of media consumption are correlated with pretty negative health outcomes, right? Obesity, sleep deprivation, poor academic achievement, drug use, certain antisocial behavior, right? Cyberbullying, aggression, right? So easy to be a big tough person, right, on the internet when you don't have to face the immediate consequence of your behavior, right? So there's a downside to spending way too much time online, right? And I'm saying that in an online course, ironically, right? But there's a major downside, right? It is important to unplug, right, from social media, unplug from devices, right? Get into the real world, touch some grass once in a while. Parents who report high media use among their children also report more inattention problems, right? Oppositional behavior, depressive symptoms, and so on. So just a whole lot of negative outcomes associated with being too plugged into media. And that just seems like a dilemma right now that we haven't yet quite figured out how to manage that, right? There have been some proposals around like not allowing children under the age of 16 to have a smartphone, right? Just kind of like banning children from having tablets and smartphones. It's pretty tempting. I don't know what you think about that, but those are some of the propositions that I've seen on the table. We'll talk a little about risk-taking in adolescence. Like we said, teenagers are sort of programmed to be more risk-taking in general. It can be considered developmentally normal in adolescence to take risks. Why? Well, risk-taking does support autonomy-related goals and autonomy-related needs. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's kind of more like, what are the influences in taking risks, and who's helping, teens navigate the emotional impact associated with their more risky behavior. At the same time, mortality rates jump 200 to 300% in adolescence as a result of preventable deaths, accidents, and other risky behaviors. Teenagers far outrank every other age group in car fatalities, for example. Right? The homicide rate among teenagers in the United States is like 5 to 8 times higher than in a lot of other developed countries. Most major mental health disorders begin in adolescence. Most substance use disorders across the lifespan begin in adolescence. So these are some realities that we have to kind of grapple with and think about, right? How to support teenagers, navigate some of these changes. On the other hand, right, no two adolescents are exactly the same. And some teens are more vulnerable to risk-taking than others. When does risky behavior turn into a risky lifestyle? I'll kind of leave you with that question, right? At some point, maybe risk-taking becomes an end in itself. It just becomes a way of being. And that we may be more concerned with, right? There's like time-limited risk-taking, just experimenting and exploring and having fun. And then there's a way in which that can become sort of a lifestyle for some people. And that's when it may be correlated with, again, certain negative outcomes later in life. Talk about, again, peer versus parent influence. The company we keep matters. Risky behavior is more likely to occur in peer groups that endorse and promote that kind of behavior. In one meta-analysis of 75 longitudinal studies on smoking, for example, peer influence was strongly correlated with beginning smoking. Ad campaigns that point out how prevalent rates of risky behavior are among teens might inadvertently convey the message that they should do those things to be more like their peers. Right? It's kind of like the Streisand effect, right? It's like kids don't even think that might be a thing, and then they see an ad campaign that's like, hey, make sure you don't do X, and it's like, ooh, X, that sounds kind of interesting. Whereas like actually kind of encourages maybe teenagers to try those things. So gotta be careful about how you advertise the risks, because the risks might be the very thing that are most tempting to a teenager. Unsurprisingly, teens who view their parents as warm and supportive are more likely to talk about their risky behavior and work through it. So again, this is the importance of authoritative parenting, warm parenting. That with authoritative parents, kids are going to trust their parents more and be more likely to turn to them for support. And so some other interesting things as we're closing out this lecture today. Historical, social, and cultural forces can lead to the adoption of a quote-unquote fast life, in which marriage, children, and work all begin earlier, or a quote-unquote slow life trajectory, which would occur when pressure to get married and start a family is maybe reduced as a result of more resources or opportunities. This could be the difference within socioeconomic groups, right? Kids that need to put food on the table to help their families might start working in high school. From there, they might get married shortly after high school. They might start having kids, right, in their early, teens or 20s, and they're on this real fast life trajectory. Whereas kids maybe from more upper class, affluent families who have a lot of resources and opportunities, they might not need to start working until after college or later, right? They could live at home through their 20s maybe. They might be on a more kind of slow life trajectory. So we could observe differences in life trajectory based on things like socioeconomic factors. We can also look at just general trends historically. And it does look like, culturally speaking, as this graph will show you, right? We have driver's license, tried alcohol, ever dated, and working for pay. And notice the trends here, right? They're all moving down in terms of the percentage of 12th grade students who report engaging in those kinds of activities. So there are fewer and fewer 12th graders, for example, getting their driver's license. There are fewer 12th graders working than were working in 1976, or dating or drinking, right? So it does point toward a generally slower life trajectory over time, at least in the United States. So we're going to end here with society's role, right? How much support does our contemporary culture provide to teenagers? And how is the level of support we provide related to risky behavior? When more socially conventional, positive opportunities are lacking, where are teenagers going to go, right? If the problems associated with teenagers is located entirely within the teenager, then there's less of an incentive for society to provide support, right? So if we just say it's all on you and you're on your own, well, that's kind of a lonely, kind of shitty place to be, in my opinion, right? It's like, what is society's role in terms of providing meaningful opportunities for teenagers to pursue at school, in their community, right? Are there worthwhile volunteer opportunities, job opportunities, work opportunities available to them? How much support are they getting at school from their teachers, from their school communities, right? Those questions are really important for us to grapple with. If, as a society, we emphasize adolescent self-sufficiency and sophistication and de-emphasize adolescent needs for adult time, guidance, structure, and connection, then we do them and ourselves a great disservice. I think that's a great quote to end on for the lecture on adolescence, right? There's this idea that teenagers, they don't need their parents anymore, or their parents are like, they don't need me anymore, they're on their own. And I think that's really wrong. Yeah, I think we still need support. We still need help and guidance and mentorship from adults when we're teenagers. We're not completely self-sufficient at that time. We're still very much developing. And so I think that's an important thing for us to consider, and an important thing for you to assess if you're working with teenagers is to assess the level of family involvement, parental support, and school support when you're thinking about how to best support an individual teen. And with that, we're going to end Module 4, and I'll see you next week for Module 5. Bye.